Now that we know how to complete the square, let's see how we can apply that to a real world problem. So Libby's plan, well, first we want to complete the square. We want to have that as our solving method with this real world problem. Libby plans to create a rectangular pasturing enclosure. She has 340 meters of fencing available for the enclosure's perimeter and wants it to have an area of 6,000 meters squared. What dimensions should Libby use? So we know that we want the area to equal 6,000 square meters. And we also know that area is equal to length times width. So if we can come up with, if we can define our length and our width, we can just plug into this area equals length times width with our 6,000. So they gave us one other helpful piece of information that will help us define the length and the width, and that's that 340 meters. That's the fencing that she has available for the perimeter of her enclosure. Well, perimeter we find by taking 2 times the width plus 2 times the length, and that will equal our perimeter, which we know to be 340. So all we're going to do here is let's solve for either length or width, and then we will have we will have our variables defined so that we can plug into this formula right here. So I'm just going to go ahead and solve for the width. To get that W alone in this equation over here, I'm going to subtract 2L from both sides. That leaves us with 2W is equal to 340 minus 2L. Let's divide everything by 2 so that we can get our width is equal to 340 divided by 2 is 170, and then 2L divided by 2 would leave us with just L, so minus L. So our width is equal to 170 minus the length, and then our length will still just be the length. So if we come over here to the right, our area equals 6,000. Let's plug in. Area is length times width equal to 6,000. We know that the length is L, and the width we just said we defined as 170 minus L equals 6,000. So let's go ahead and multiply this out. We now have an equation with all L's. So we're going to be able to find the length that we need, and once we know the length, we're able to get the width because we'll just take 170 minus the length. So to solve this equation, we're going to go ahead and distribute. This gives us 170L minus L squared equals 6,000. Let's write this in the proper order. We know that we want that squared term first, so just negative L squared plus 170L equals 6,000. And now let's use that method of completing the square. The one thing for completing the square is you do want your squared term to be positive. So what we can do here is we can just divide both sides of the equation by a -1. Basically, every single term divides by -1. We also could multiply every single term by a -1 and get the same result. That's going to leave us with a positive L squared, a negative 170L, and a negative 6,000. All right, our solving method is completing the square. We want to complete this into a perfect square trinomial. So we have to add in what should be our third term so that it's a perfect square. So I'm going to go ahead and L squared minus 170L plus something is going to just, I'm pushing off that equals negative 6,000. So we have a way to get this third term that we saw in our other videos. If you take your B value, which is negative 170, divide it by 2 and square that. So negative 170 divided by 2 is a negative 85, excuse me. Negative 85 squared is a positive 7,225. So I'm going to add in 7,225. This is an equation. We're adding that 7,225 to one side, so we have to add it in to the other side as well. Okay, This is probably not super recognizable as a perfect square trinomial, but it is. Um, Something times itself equals 7,225, and it adds up to negative 170. You could find that number a couple ways. If you took the square root of that 7,225, you would get 85. Um, so 85 times 85 multiplies to this. 85 plus 85 multiplies to a positive 170. So what if we use two negative 85s? The other thing you may have been noticing is when we do our b over 2 and then we square it, whatever that b over 2 value was is always what we're looking for to put right into our factored form of this, x minus 85 squared. So 85 times 85 is, or negative 85 times negative 85 is 7,225. Negative 85 plus negative 85 is a negative 170. Okay, so that is equal to, when we combine these terms over here, we get 1,225. Okay, now we're going to solve for x. Oops, not x. Did you guys catch that? That should be an L. Let's see if it will even let me erase it. Oh, there we go. I'm so used to using L's. There we go, L minus. So let's square root both sides. When we square root, we cancel the square, leaving us with L minus 85 equals, now the square root of 1,225. We get two answers when we square root when solving these equations. And then this is a perfect square. Square root of 1,225 is 35. So here's where we're going to break it into our two equations. L minus 85 equals 35, and L minus 85 equals negative 35. So we're just taking this positive and negative 35 and splitting it up into our two equations. If you add 85 to both sides, on this one we get 120. If you add 85 to both sides in our second equation, we get a positive 50. So we're finding that the length can be 120 or the length could be 50. Those are both plausible answers. So how do we know which one it should be? Well, let's see what we think about that. If we plug those in, so just trying to change my marker color. Here we go. So if the length is equal to 120, then the width is equal to, remember we defined the width above. We said the width was 170 minus the length. So 170 minus 120, we have a width of 50. So length is 120, width is 50. That's one possibility for our first solution of 120. Well, what if our length is 50? The width would be 170 minus 50, and 170 minus 50 is 120. So if the length is 50, the width is 120. Basically, we're finding the same dimensions of the rectangle. Length times width, well, if the length is 120 and the width is 50, that gives us the same area and the same perimeter. Or the length could be 50, leaving us with a 120 for the width. Those multiply to our 6,000, that gives us the same perimeter. So what should the dimensions be? That length and width are interchangeable. So the dimensions should be 120 by 50, I'm assuming we're in feet. Those are the dimensions we need.